Okay, so we are entering a new time period after the first 11 chapters of Genesis. This next time period is the era of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Here are some images of some well known leaders: Pope Francis, Martin Luther King Jr., George Washington, a founding father, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, U.S. Supreme Court Justice. So, just some images of some revered leaders, male and female, similar to the patriarchs and the matriarchs that we'll be studying in this unit. So, what is a patriarch? Well, the definition of a patriarch is simply a male leader of a family or a tribe. So, think Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, who we'll meet later. And matriarchs as well are simply the counterpart, the female counterpart to the patriarchs. So, Sarah, wife of Abraham, Rebecca, and Rachel. So, this little passage from the Catechism of the Catholic Church kind of sets the context here. So it reads: In order to gather together scattered humanity, God calls Abram from his country, his kindred, and his father's house, essentially leaving everything behind, and makes him Abraham, that is, the father of a multitude. In you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram, exalted father, will become Abraham, father of a multitude. And just wanted to note that in that first line, scattered humanity, that's an echo, that's a reference to the Tower of Babel and the end of that story where humanity is scattered. And now God is going to call Abraham to lead his rescue mission, to gather his people back to himself. So, who was Abram? Well, as I just mentioned a moment ago, Abram means exalted father. He lived around 2000 BC or BCE. So, we have a nice round number. That's a guesstimation, but somewhere around that time. And also, it's just a note that we are now in a more historically verifiable time period rather than those first 11 chapters where we're dealing with prehistory, really before historical records were kept. Now, Abraham, his name will be changed by God, which is always significant. Abraham means a father of a multitude, and he is 75 years old when God calls him. Now, Abram, if you can see on your screen here, he is from which is an ancient city in Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq. And Abraham's going to travel from there with his family up to Haran. And that is where Abram will be called by God at 75 years of age. Now, this next part here, this next slide you're looking at, it's actually a video that we watched together in class. So I'll go ahead and move by this, but I think this video is important. It's a little dry, maybe like this video lecture, but it is informative and I think pretty helpful. So this next section that we're going to deal with deals with Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, and this is God's threefold promise to Abraham. God promises three things to Abram: a land and a nation. He will make of him a great nation. He will make him a great name, and the world will be blessed through him. Now, that second one, the name, that's also another reference in contrast to the Tower of Babel, where the people in Babel were trying to make a great name for themselves. God tells Abram, I will make your name great. So we see a distinction there. So the first promise, Abraham's descendants will possess the land. We're going to see that each of these promises won't be fulfilled in Abraham's time, but they will be fulfilled by future biblical people and significant ones. So who's going to fulfill this first promise that Abraham's descendants will possess the land? That's going to be Moses, and really Joshua too. But for our purposes, Moses fulfills that first one several hundred years later. Promise number 2, God tells Abraham, I will make of you a great name. In other words, kings are going to come from his line of descendants. And who's going to fulfill this second promise? King David. In the third promise, Abraham will be a source of worldwide blessing. All nations will be blessed through him, which, if we look around today, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all look to Abraham as the father of their faith. So we can see that that blessing has come true for billions of people. And who's going to fulfill this third promise for our purposes? It's Jesus and the Catholic Church. So Moses fulfills that first one, land and nation. And David's going to fulfill that second one of a great name, and kings are going to come from Abraham's line. And then finally, Jesus fulfills that worldwide blessing. So just a few things to know. I'm going to leave these blank here, but these are some things you want to know: the meaning of Abram and Abraham, what those names mean, and then the threefold promise that I just mentioned. Now, this next slide sets up a video that I would like you to watch, and I think it's a great illustration of the difference between mere intellectual belief and faith, which is really belief in action. So the story of Blondin, this historical person, he's a tightrope walker, and if you watch the video, you'll see some of his feats that he performs, and then he invites some of the crowd to jump in this wheelbarrow that he's wheeling across back and forth over Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And while the people believe that he can do it, that he could bring a person across, no one's willing to jump in that wheelbarrow. And I think that's really where the distinction lies between believing that someone can do something, and then putting our trust in that person. And in this case, if we relate it to faith, God invites us to get into that wheelbarrow and trust in him. And I think Abraham certainly does that. And in this little passage here from St. Paul to the Romans, he mentions this. He talks about Abraham as the founder of the Jewish nation. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. And I don't think, and certainly in the biblical context, Paul doesn't mean that he simply believed, but that he trusted and that he took action. And while Abraham is the father of the faith, his faith will be tested, as we'll see. He'll grow impatient, as does Sarah. And Sarah, his wife, and to their defense, it is 11 years later now. Abraham's 86, and they still haven't had a son. And so Sarah's going to encourage Abraham to take her maidservant and have a child with her, and perhaps build a family through her and her child. And that child will be Ishmael. And it sounds a little maybe strange to us, this situation, and certainly it wasn't God's plan. But this wasn't an uncommon practice in the context. It's kind of their ancient way of surrogate motherhood. So while Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, does have this child Ishmael, things don't really go very smoothly. There's jealousy, there's some bitterness, and then 13 years later, Sarah is going to have her own child, who will be named Isaac. And the name Isaac means laughter, because Abraham and Sarah both sort of laughed at God when he told them that they would actually have their own son. And we did watch a few clips of this in class, just to kind of bring some of these scenes to life. And then finally, to kind of end this unit as we get to the end of it, Abraham's faith is going to be tested ultimately when he is asked by God to essentially offer Isaac up. Isaac is now a little older, and Abraham's being instructed to bring Isaac up to this mountain and to offer him as a sacrifice. So pretty challenging text to understand. The homework questions, pages 44 through 45, certainly, I think, help us to maybe understand this story in the context a little bit. But why this test? The Catechism tells us that this is a final stage in the purification of Abraham's faith. So Abraham's faith was not perfect. He grew in his faith step by step, and this test here really challenged him to really express how willing he was to trust God all the way with everything. And I think that's really what the author of this text is trying to get across, that Abraham was willing to go to sacrifice everything. And this is also a typology moment. And typology, we talked about earlier this semester, is how the Old Testament foreshadows the New, and the New Testament echoes the Old. So we'll just take a look at how this story connects to the New Testament story of Jesus. So first of all, we have the obvious one, a father who is offering up his beloved son. In the Old Testament, Abraham's offering up Isaac, which he doesn't go through with because God stops him, but God himself will offer his son and go through with it, obviously, in the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And we also have a son who submits to the Father's will. So Isaac goes along with Abraham, and certainly Jesus with God the Father. And an interesting one is that Isaac is carrying the wood on his shoulders up to Mount Moriah, and Jesus is carrying the cross up to Mount Calvary. So we have a connection there as well. And then one that not everybody really would know just by reading it, but the location is actually the same. So this Mount Moriah in the Old Testament and Calvary, where Jesus was crucified in the New, same place. And the city and the location is Jerusalem, and that comes from two words in the Hebrew, Jireh and Shalom, which essentially means the Lord will provide his peace. And certainly that's what Jesus comes to do in the New Testament. There's a few more connections and details in the passages that we read together in class, but hopefully this brings you up to speed a little bit. And certainly if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.